Hi guys, Rod from Bensonian Thought Videos here, and this is the third video in my series examining the underlying philosophy that gives rise to the scientific method. So in the last two videos, we have examined the four main presuppositions which govern the scientific method. They all start with the letter C, and were coexistence, coherence, correspondence, and conservation. Most of the last video was spent talking about conservation, which is the principle that the laws of the universe are conserved through space-time. The conservation laws result in fundamental physical constants, which are also assumed to be space-time invariant. We then went on to consider what constitutes a scientific law and its related space-time invariance. We considered the idea that determining what a fundamental law is not always straightforward, nor what constants are invariant. One striking example is the special theory of relativity, with Einstein demonstrating that in order for the speed of light to remain constant in every reference frames, it means that space and time itself can change when one compares two objects that are in vastly different reference frames in relation to each other as their relative velocities approach the speed of light. We also considered how the nonsensical statement gravity is an attractive force and a repulsive force can be made coherent, meeting our zeroth presupposition of logical consistency, by introducing a time difference. Gravity is an attractive force at the present time, but it is a repulsive force in a million years' time. In this fantasy example, we might have another more fundamental law which controls the value of the gravitational force, which is time dependent. While such a model of the universe would still meet our coherency and correspondence test for scientific validity, we have paid a price in that the model we now have is more complicated than the one where gravity is a conserved constant, such as in our universe. With these considerations in mind, we are now ready to introduce the first important tool of the scientific method, and that is Occam's razor. I have already done a previous video on Occam's razor in relation to theism and scientism, which you can check out using the link below. While I describe Occam's razor in the previous video, the full importance of this principle can now be appreciated once we understand the ambiguity of determining what entities in the universe are fundamental and what relationships constitute scientific laws. Keeping to my letters C's, I am going to refer to Occam's razor by the one-word summary of compaction, in that Occam's razor really is there to compact our model of the universe into its most simplest possible form. William of Occam was a Franciscan monk, and his original statement went, "Entities must not be multiplied beyond necessity." Or to expand a little using our previous developed terminology, if a theory is both correspondent and coherent with a certain number of laws and entities, then the introduction of any new laws or entities which do not increase the correspondence of the theory to the reality being described is invalid and must be avoided. So let's return to our gravity example. As far as we know, the gravitational constant is space-time invariant. Now, it would be possible for me to develop a theory where I claim that the force of gravity is slowly decreasing with time. I might say G is inversely proportional to time, but set the equation in such a way that one could only observe, say, a 0.0001% decrease in gravitational constant after 100 billion years. In such a model, given the current age of the universe is estimated to be 13.77 billion years old, the gravitational constant would appear invariant because it is only decreased by 1 part in 7 times 10 to the 24. That's a 7 with 24 noughts after it, during the last 13.77 billion years, which of course would not be measurable by any instrument. Yet Occam's razor demands that I desist with such science fantasy, precisely because my more complex model for the gravitational constant gets me absolutely nowhere, because it makes the model more complicated without increasing the model's correspondence, the second presuppositional principle, to the observed data. The compaction principle, by definition, makes the whole discipline of science reductionistic. What I mean by this is that the aim of science is to develop models, theories, and laws which by their very nature have reduced the complexity or the number of entities that were present in the original subject under study. For example, the scientific law force equals mass multiplied by acceleration, reduces all the observed combinations of accelerations, masses, and forces to a simple single equation, and this is why the practice of science is so powerful. At the end of the 20th century, the practice of reductionism came under attack. With the rise of postmodernism and the New Age movement, many felt that this was the whole problem with the scientific method. It is too reductionistic, was the catch cry of many in the 90s. While as a Christian I disagree with a lot of Dawkins' writings, his defense of scientific reductionism in his book The Blind Watchmaker is both elegant and accurate. In the book he presents the idea of a hierarchal reductionism, which by his terminology highlights the fact that one can reduce complex entities down to different levels. When we examine complex entities like living things, we can reduce them through many different levels before we arrive at the most fundamental one. What is interesting is in the universe we inhabit, all complex things can be reduced back to fundamentally simple component parts. While this might seem like an obvious statement, one can at least conceive of a universe where this property did not hold. For instance, imagine a universe which was similar to ours in that it contained all the basic elements of the periodic table. However, let us further imagine that the living things in this universe were composed of a substance that is totally different from the elements of the periodic table. We shall call this substance complexion. Complexion is indivisible. It is not able to be broken down into component parts. In this universe, the death of a creature results in their complete annihilation, no remaining corpse, because complexion either exists as these creatures or not at all. In this universe, hierarchical reductionism would be impossible because there is a discontinuity between complex and simple things. While one could reduce non-living entities back to more fundamental levels, living entities could not be reduced. Yet this is not the universe we inhabit. Rather, there appears to be complete continuity in our universe. All complex living entities are composed of simpler entities, which are composed of simpler entities, and so on. A reduction of just one level will therefore help us make sense of an entity we are currently investigating. Dawkins uses the example of a computer and shows how hierarchical reductionism works. This is from Dawkins' book, The Blind Watchmaker. A satisfying explanation has to be in terms of a manageably small number of interactions. This is why, if we want to understand the workings of computers, we prefer a preliminary explanation in terms of about a dozen major subcomponents: memory, processing mill, backing store, control unit, input-output handler, etc. Having grasped the interactions between the half or a dozen major components, we then may wish to ask questions about the internal organization of these major components. Only specialist engineers are likely to go down to the level of the AND gates and the NOR gates, and only physicists will go down further to the level of how electrons behave in a semiconducting medium. He then continues. For those who like ism sorts of names, the aptest name for my approach to understand how things work is probably hierarchical reductionism. If you read trendy intellectual magazines, you may have noticed that reductionism is one of those things, like sin, that is only mentioned by people who are against it. To call oneself a reductionist will sound, in some circles, a bit like admitting to eating babies. But just as nobody actually eats babies, so nobody is really a reductionist in any sense worth being against. The non-existent reductionist, the sort that everybody is against, but who exists only in their imaginations, tries to explain complicated things directly in terms of the smallest parts, even, in some extreme versions of the myth, as the sum of the parts. The hierarchical reductionist, on the other hand, explains a complex entity at any particular level in the hierarchy of the organization in terms of entities only one level down the hierarchy, entities which themselves are likely to be complex enough to need further reducing to their own component parts, and so on. Reductionism, in this sense, is just another name for an honest desire to understand how things work. Now, Dawkins at this point is totally correct. Reductionism is intrinsic to the practice of science, and without it, science ceases to exist. However, Dawkins also touches on where reductionism can go wrong, and mythical reductionists really do exist. Dawkins is a prime example of a person whose use of reductionism has got out of control. The problem is Dawkins elevates reductionism to a position where it has become the arbitrator of all truth. In doing so, he divorces the method of science from its axiomatic underpinnings, since reductionism itself is dependent on the very underpinnings for its own validity, because reductionism has no validity in testing the very axioms of the scientific method. Furthermore, a reductionist must dismiss or redefine the existence of any entity which is non-reducible, because they all stubbornly demand that all components of reality are reducible. Even in the scientific arena, where reductionism is mostly appropriate, the progress of science can be delayed when Occam's razor is used too quickly and liberally to simplify a theory, ignoring data which shows that the theory in its simplified form does not match up with the reality it is attempting to describe. I would argue this is especially a problem in biological research. Another example where scientific reductionism would not be an appropriate intellectual tool would be in answering the simple question, why did John kiss Kate? One obvious answer would be the simple statement, because John loves Kate. This statement is true, yet it is not scientific, because love is a much more complicated entity than a kiss. In other words, the explanation is valid even though there is no reduction of complexity in sight. Thus, science does not hold the only keys to all truth, as some scientists like to think. Before I close this thought, let us consider one more question. If there was such an entity in our universe that was truly non-reducible, how would it appear when the scientific method is applied to it? Well, the answer would be that you might find it impossible to link the more simple components of your reduced model to the entity you are trying to describe. In such a situation, you will end up with an infinite regress type question. You might say that entity A operates because of the actions of the more basic components B, C, and D. However, when you try to come up with a model for how B, C, and D produce A, you are simply left with the question, yes, but why does this interaction of B, C, and D produce A? For me, it is very tempting to speculate that we do have an entity A in our universe, and that's our own phenomenological consciousness. Now, of course, science attempts to link human consciousness back to brain function, but the obvious infinite regress question that will arise, independent of any neurological model for consciousness, is why does this particular configuration of neurons and neurotransmitters result in your personhood looking out of your eyes in 2021 and not out of my eyes or the eyes of someone who lived 1,000 years ago? Since from a purely operational point of view, our brains would appear to share the same overall biological model. I really believe that this unanswerable question demonstrates that human personhood, as found inside consciousness, is truly an example of a complexion, in that there is no path of reducing this entity back to its more fundamental components. It exists in life, and at the point of death it ceases to exist. Now, of course, the materialists will completely disagree, arguing that there must be a coherent scientific path to reduce consciousness back to some complex biological entity, which itself can be reduced through the hierarchies of explanations back to the more fundamental levels. They would just claim that we have not yet found this path. The problem here is who sets the rules in terms of what is considered a satisfactory explanation. You see, many materialists take the Turing approach of defining human consciousness operationally, stating that if you create a machine that cannot be distinguished by human interrogators from another person, then this machine must be conscious. However, I think this definition is flawed, because although we sensibly assume all other humans are conscious, like we are, we cannot prove it. We are simply operating under that very sensible assumption. The point is that just because an entity can behave like a conscious human, it does not mean that within its own internal frame of reference it is self-aware. It could simply be a very complicated unconscious machine that is able to process inputs and execute outputs in such a way that it mimics a conscious entity. These ideas really are also at the heart of the theism versus the atheism debate. The bottom line is not whether the universe self-actualized or existed eternally, but whether the eternal parts of our reality, and there are eternal parts to our reality, contain a conscious self-aware entity, which theists call God, or whether consciousness itself arises from whatever fundamental entities existed before the universe was born, even if those eternal entities are just the laws of mathematics and logic itself. If it is the latter, then this would be somewhat ironic, because maths and logic appear to be the children of conscious activity. So if they are also its father, then we truly have reached a circular infinite regress, which is every bit as mysterious as the idea of an uncreated God. The harsh truth is that whether you are an atheist or a theist, you cannot escape the infinite regress of what is the ultimate origin of this strange reality in which we find ourselves. Okay, so that is my thought video for this week. Next week, we shall move on to consider the final tool of science, which, to stick with my C's, I give the name calculation, although really it is mathematics. And wow, maths is one of the most amazing tools of science. So please do continue to watch these videos as I start to unpack this amazing tool. In the meantime, if you like this video, please do hit the like key, and if you want to see more of my content, then please do subscribe to my channel by hitting the subscribe button and the bell notification key below. Also, I would love to hear your comments about my material, so please do drop a line in the comments section below if you have any thoughts, queries, or questions, or even disagreements. It's always great to discuss these things. So until next time, I hope your body and mind are in a good place, and bye for now.